When American pilots got their hands on a downed Japanese Betty bomber at Clark Air Base during World War II, they were expecting the usual technical surprises, maybe clever engineering or unique layouts. What they didn't expect was a flying death trap. The entire aircraft had zero fuel tank protection, no self-sealing rubber, no armor, no fire suppression, just thin metal tanks stuffed into some of the most vulnerable.
If you enjoyed this breakdown, don't forget to like, subscribe, and drop a comment. Your feedback helps shape what we cover next, and you being here keeps the conversation going. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.
Parts of the plane, and they weren't damaged or ripped out. That's how it was designed. This wasn't a mistake. This was intentional. Japanese engineers had made a choice, one that told American analysts everything they needed to know about Japan's military priorities. Speed and range over everything, including human lives. The Mitsubishi G4M, nicknamed Betty by the Allies, wasn't just another bomber. It was Japan's pride, a long-range, twin-engine medium bomber that could fly over 3,700 miles, carry a heavy payload, and deliver devastating attacks across the Pacific. In the early stages of the war, it lived up to the hype. Fast, nimble, and capable of striking targets far beyond the reach of Allied defenses, the Betty gave Japan a real edge. But there was a dark trade-off. The Betty's impressive range came at a massive cost. To keep it lightweight and extend its operational reach, designers stripped it of defensive armor. They left the fuel tanks completely exposed, unprotected by any of the self-sealing or shielding tech used by the Allies. In combat, this meant a single bullet, a single spark, could and often did turn the entire aircraft into a fireball. When American crews finally got a chance to dissect a downed Betty in the Philippines, what they saw was horrifying. The fuel tanks weren't even hidden. They were placed in areas most likely to be hit inside the wings and fuselage without any self-sealing material or structural protection. One hit, and that was it. Compare that to American bombers like the B-17 Flying Fortress or the B-24 Liberator. Those beasts were covered in armor. They had armored cockpit glass, reinforced crew compartments, and most importantly, self-sealing fuel tanks, rubber-lined and designed to swell up and block leaks when hit. Their goal wasn't just to deliver bombs. It was to bring the crew home. American engineers knew what it took to survive modern air combat. The Japanese, they were betting on not getting caught. And early in the war, that gamble worked. In 1941 and early 1942, the Betty bomber wreaked havoc. With its extreme range, Japan could launch attacks from bases far beyond Allied fighter coverage. It wasn't just a bomber, it was a symbol of how far Japan's reach could extend across the Pacific. Strategic targets from the Philippines to northern Australia were suddenly vulnerable. But this was all built on a dangerous assumption that Japan could keep fighting from a distance without ever facing serious interception. That the war would be fast and decisive, and that Allied defenses would never catch up. Spoiler, they caught up. As American fighter strength surged, so did the number of Bettys getting shot out of the sky. It started during the Guadalcanal campaign in mid-1942. Bettys sent on bombing runs began returning in pieces if they returned at all. Fighters like the F-4F Wildcat, and later the F-6F Hellcat and P-38 Lightning, tore through the unprotected bombers like paper. And there was no room for error. When a Betty got hit, it burned. The unprotected fuel tanks practically invited fire. Crews rarely had time to bail out. The survival rate was so low, it was barely worth tracking. By the middle of the war, the Betty wasn't just vulnerable, it was doomed. Its early strength had relied on its ability to outrun danger. But once that edge was lost, so was everything else. It couldn't absorb hits. It couldn't fight back effectively. It could only run, and it was running out of time. The math behind it was brutal. Every kilogram they saved by cutting armor and safety measures was turned into extra fuel, more range. That made sense for Japan's strategic goals: strike fast, strike far, and assume enemy resistance would be light. But as Allied air defenses hardened and interception became routine, that extra range became meaningless. The Betty was built to fly far, not survive. Worse, these weren't just tactical losses, they were catastrophic human losses. Entire squadrons were wiped out. Crews who had trained for years were lost in single missions. The design made survival almost impossible. One hit, and the aircraft often exploded mid-air. The Allies took a completely different path. For the U.S., trained air crews were valuable. They were seen as assets worth protecting, not just expendable tools. American planes were designed with survivability in mind, even if that meant flying a little slower or a little shorter. And over time, that difference became impossible to ignore. American bombers came back from missions riddled with holes, with dead engines, missing wings, and still, they limped home. Betty's didn't. They vanished in the sky, one flash at a time. It wasn't just a technical failure. It was a philosophical one. The Betty wasn't just a bomber, it was a reflection of Japan's entire wartime strategy. Bold, aggressive, willing to risk everything for a powerful first strike. But when the war dragged on, and attrition took over, that gamble collapsed. There were no backup plans. No room for adaptation. The aircraft that once represented Japan's long-range power had become an airborne coffin. And then came the final twist. In one of the most surreal scenes of the war, it was Betty bombers that carried the Japanese surrender delegation to meet the Allies in 1945. The aircraft, once painted in camouflage and flying low to avoid enemy fire, were now painted completely white, with green crosses to signal peace. No guns, no bombs, just two Bettys flying their last mission, not to attack, but to surrender. Talk about poetic. From deadly weapon to peace envoy, the Betty's final flight was symbolic. The ultimate war machine reduced to a career of surrender. A final acknowledgement of how Japan's strategy and its deadly design choices had run out of fuel. The lessons from the Betty are still studied today, not just as a matter of engineering, but as a case study in how military doctrine and national values shape technology. Japan's decision to sacrifice protection for range wasn't just a technical call, it was cultural. It reflected a willingness to trade human lives for operational capability. And it failed. The tragic irony is that by sacrificing survivability, Japan ended up losing both the planes and the people. The technology they believed would secure dominance across the Pacific became one of the war's most tragic miscalculations. So when American crews stood around the captured Betty at Clark Air Base, shaking their heads in disbelief, it wasn't just about the missing armor or exposed fuel tanks. It was the realization that an entire military had bet everything on speed and reach at the cost of the very men flying the planes. In the end, the Betty bomber is remembered not just for its early power or its long range, but for the price it demanded. Thousands of lost crews, countless lives sacrificed in the name of performance, and a stark reminder that technology without protection isn't power, it's tragedy. If you found this story as jaw-dropping as we did, hit that like button and share it with someone who loves military history. Drop a comment below, we want to hear your take on Japan's bomber strategy. And don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into the wildest moments from the past. What made the Betty bomber so infamous wasn't just the numbers, it was the pattern. Mission after mission, the outcome was the same. They'd take off with their massive range advantage, cross hundreds of miles of ocean, drop their payload, and then vanish on the way back. Not because of mechanical failure, not because of weather, but because the moment Allied fighters caught them, it was over. Pilots started calling it the flying lighter. One spark, and the whole thing went up. And here's the part that still stuns military historians. This wasn't a fluke. Japanese command knew the Betty was fragile. They knew it was vulnerable. They knew it had no real armor. But they stuck with it anyway. Because to them, the priority wasn't survivability, it was offensive reach. The Pacific was a big place. Japan needed aircraft that could hit distant islands, ships, bases, everything. And they believed speed and range would keep them safe. But that belief was rooted in a fantasy that the enemy wouldn't catch up, that they wouldn't adapt. Spoiler alert, they adapted fast. Once the US cracked the code literally and figuratively on Japanese tactics, the Betty's days were numbered. Coordinated fighter patrols, radar-guided interceptions, better armaments. The Allies weren't just defending anymore, they were hunting. And Betty's made for easy prey. Worse yet, the Betty's own defenses were laughably limited. It had a few gun positions, but they were manually operated, underpowered, and poorly placed. In theory, a formation of Bettys could cover each other with overlapping fire. In practice, it barely mattered. Allied fighters tore through them like wet paper. And once the first Betty in a formation went up in flames, the rest usually followed. Crews weren't just being shot down, they were being incinerated. And the psychological toll, devastating. Surviving crew members knew the odds. They knew they were flying into missions with a low probability of coming back. Veterans began calling it a one-way ticket. Morale plunged. Attrition skyrocketed. You can only watch so many friends burn alive before it stops feeling like a war and starts feeling like a death sentence. There's a chilling statistic that often gets cited. By 1943, Betty losses were so high that entire groups had to be reorganized or dissolved. It wasn't just about individual planes anymore. It was an entire system collapsing under its own flawed logic. And still, Japan kept using the Betty. They tried modifying its stripping weight in other places, adding a few patches of armor here and there. But the damage was done. The core design philosophy hadn't changed. The trade-off speed and range over crew safety was baked into the DNA of the aircraft. You couldn't just slap on a few armor plates and hope for the best. And that's what makes this story so haunting. It wasn't just a bad design. It was a symptom of a larger problem, a military culture that treated human lives as expendable. Where pilots were tools, where mission success was everything, and survival was optional. In contrast, look at how the Americans approached it. U.S. bombers were built like tanks with wings. Yes, they were slower, heavier, but they were designed to survive. You can't train a B-17 crew overnight. You can't replace experience with optimism. The Americans knew that a well-trained crew was more valuable than any one mission, and they designed their aircraft accordingly. Every bit of armor, every reinforced fuel tank, every escape hatchet was all there to give the crew a chance. Not a guarantee, but a chance. That difference in philosophy played out in every single engagement. You had U.S. crews limping home in shredded aircraft, landing with engines out, shot full of holes and living to fight another day. And you had Betty crews. Well, they didn't land. They didn't return. They didn't get a second chance. And that, more than anything else, is what the Betty represents now. Not the long-range strikes or the early war successes, but the cost of arrogance. The cost of assuming the enemy will never catch up. The cost of valuing firepower over lives. It's easy to point fingers in hindsight, to say what were they thinking. But the truth is, Japan's entire war strategy was built on the idea of overwhelming force delivered early and fast. They never planned for a long war. They never planned for a grinding attrition battle. Their bombers weren't designed to endure, they were designed to win quickly. And when that didn't happen, the cracks showed, fast. There's also something symbolic about the Betty's transformation at the end of the war. From death machine to peace carrier. When the surrender delegation boarded those white-painted Bettys in 1945, it was the ultimate full circle. The same aircraft that had once delivered destruction across the Pacific was now stripped of its weapons, painted with surrender markings, and flying into history as a symbol of defeat. It was quiet, unarmed, empty. That final flight was peaceful. But the ghosts on board, heavy, because every rivet, every panel, every exposed fuel tank on that aircraft carried the weight of the war's most brutal lessons. You can build the fastest, longest-range bomber in the world, but if you don't protect the people inside it, what's the point? The Betty is remembered today not just for what it did but for what it lacked. And that absence tells the real story. And here's the most chilling part, the people flying those planes. They didn't have a choice. They were handed the keys to a machine that was never built to bring them home. And they flew it anyway. Mission after mission. Knowing full well that one hit would be their last. That kind of sacrifice should never be forgotten. Not because it was noble but because it was avoidable. Military historians often call the Betty the best bad bomber of the war. And that feels right. It was brilliant in some ways. Technologically daring. Strategically ambitious. But also fatally flawed. A masterclass in how one wrong design choice repeated and ignored can ripple out into disaster. And if there's one lesson that stands out above all else, it's this: performance means nothing if no one survives to talk about it. You can have range, speed, firepower, but if you don't make it back, that mission doesn't count. That data doesn't matter. That plane becomes a cautionary tale, not a legacy. The Betty bomber became just that. A cautionary tale burned into the history books, one riddled with bullet holes and soaked in tragedy. And now, over 80 years later, we're still talking about it. Because some designs are unforgettable. Let's take it even further. Because the legacy of the Betty bomber doesn't just stop at engineering or strategy, it's also a window into the mindset of a military machine that believed in sacrifice above survival. And that belief It's one of the most sobering parts of this whole story. Japanese military doctrine during World War II was rooted in the idea of honorable death. The idea that dying for the emperor, dying for the mission, was not just expected, it was celebrated. That's why, even as crews were being incinerated in these fragile aircraft, the solution wasn't better armor or safer design. The solution, in many cases, was more obedience. And that's where the Betty fits into the broader narrative. It became part of a war effort that increasingly leaned into desperation over practicality. When the tide turned and Japan started losing territory, losing ships, losing pilots, they didn't adapt with more survivable planes. They doubled down on sacrifice. Eventually, some Bettys were even used in kamikaze-style missions, loaded with explosives, stripped down even further, and sent on one-way trips toward American ships. At that point, the line between strategic bomber and flying coffin had fully disappeared. Compare that to the U.S. approach at the same point in the war. As American forces pushed across the Pacific, aircraft were being upgraded constantly. More firepower, better protection, longer ranges, but always with survivability in mind. Because from the Allied perspective, you don't win a war by burning through your own people. You win it by keeping them alive long enough to fight smarter. The Betty, in its final years, stood in stark contrast to that. It wasn't evolving. It wasn't adapting. It was just being used up. And that's why, even today, the Betty bomber remains one of the most tragic ironies of World War II. It started as a marvel of engineering, an aircraft that could outrun the competition, drop a torpedo, and disappear into the clouds before the enemy even knew what hit them. But it ended as a symbol of futility. A warplane that became more effective at destroying its own crews than defeating the enemy. American pilots had a saying when they faced Betty formations late in the war: light 'em up. Because they knew those aircraft couldn't take a hit. They didn't fear them anymore, they pitied the men inside. And when Allied engineers examined that captured Betty at Clark Air Base, what they saw wasn't brilliance, it was desperation. Every decision screamed of a nation trying to punch above its weight. The range, the speed, the payload, it all came at the cost of basic human protection. A plane designed for a short, victorious war, being used in a long, grinding one. It was never built to survive. You want a one-line summary? Here it is. The Betty bomber was a weapon designed for the opening act of a war that never gave it a second curtain call. So, yeah, it's easy to look back and critique. But that's what history is for. We study the past not to laugh at its failures but to learn from them. And the Betty teaches us something every military should never forget: performance is pointless if you can't protect the people behind the controls. It's a hard lesson, but it's one worth repeating. So if you're still watching, thank you. These stories matter. They remind us that behind every aircraft, every blueprint, every command, there are lives. And whether those lives are protected or sacrificed says everything about the people making the decisions. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Was the Betty a bold innovation that just didn't age well? Or was it a disaster waiting to happen from day one? Hit like if this gave you a new perspective. Share it if you know someone who loves military history. And don't forget to subscribe. We've got more coming, and trust me, the next story is just as unbelievable.